Pause for a moment and reflect. Why does society feel uneasy in the presence of individuals who remain calm, independent, and inwardly strong? These are not people seeking attention or recognition. They do not rebel openly, yet their very existence unsettles others. The reason is simple: systems of power depend on predictability. Most people can be guided by rewards, approval, and fear of rejection. But those who master themselves cannot be controlled by these mechanisms. They carry within them a form of freedom that is rare and threatening. History shows that institutions often resist such individuals, not because they are violent or disruptive, but because they reveal uncomfortable truths. Their independence demonstrates that constant approval, endless striving, and blind conformity are not necessary for a meaningful life. This silent strength forces others to question their own dependence on social structures. And that quiet disruption is more powerful than any rebellion. Society is built on mechanisms of control, approval, rejection, praise, and punishment. Most people adjust their behavior to maintain acceptance, fearing isolation more than anything else. But individuals who have mastered independence operate differently. They do not rely on external validation to feel secure. Their self-worth comes from inner clarity, not from applause or recognition. This makes them immune to the usual tools that institutions, workplaces, and communities use to maintain order. A promotion cannot buy their loyalty, and criticism cannot weaken their resolve. Their independence makes them unpredictable, which is deeply unsettling for systems that thrive on conformity. This unpredictability turns them into wild cards, difficult to categorize, harder to influence, and nearly impossible to manipulate. And in a world that runs on control, the presence of someone who cannot be controlled becomes a silent challenge to the stability of the entire structure. Human beings are often taught that constant social interaction, approval, and belonging are necessary for psychological survival. This belief creates dependency on groups, networks, and institutions. But when someone thrives in solitude, that assumption collapses. Their life becomes living proof that happiness and fulfillment can exist outside of collective approval. This challenges a core belief held by the majority, that without social validation, life loses meaning. For many, this realization is deeply uncomfortable, because it forces them to confront the possibility that much of their striving, networking, and conformity may be unnecessary. The silent presence of such an individual exposes the fragile foundation on which their own choices rest. Instead of questioning themselves, most people dismiss the independent person as abnormal or antisocial. In reality, what they fear is not the person, but the truth their existence represents, that freedom and fulfillment are possible without dependence on the crowd. Most people depend heavily on outcomes, success, recognition, wealth, or relationships, to define their value. They are deeply tied to the rise and fall of external circumstances. But the detached individual does not cling to these shifting measures. Their calm indifference to praise or failure unsettles others because it highlights how fragile their own sense of self truly is. When someone remains unshaken in situations where most would panic or celebrate, it creates an unspoken contrast. That contrast forces others to realize how dependent they are on things outside their control. Rather than facing this truth, many project their discomfort onto the detached person, labeling them as cold, arrogant, or disconnected. In reality, their detachment is not weakness but strength, a mastery of self that removes the power of external forces. And it is precisely this self-mastery that makes others feel their own vulnerabilities more sharply. Society functions by shared rules and unspoken agreements: how to behave, what to value, what success should look like. Most people follow these paths without question. But individuals who have cultivated inner strength rely on personal principles instead of collective expectations. Their decisions come from a deep internal compass, not from social approval or fear of rejection. This independence is unsettling because it creates a new standard of behavior, one that cannot be dictated or predicted by the group. When others see someone living fully by inner laws, they realize how often they compromise their own principles just to belong. The independent person becomes a silent mirror, exposing the cost of conformity. And because such individuals prove that life can be lived authentically without society's approval, they threaten the invisible authority that collective norms hold over people's lives. Power in society is usually measured through influence, status, or control over others. But the independent individual flips this definition upside down. Their strength does not come from authority or recognition, it comes from self-sufficiency. They do not need approval, material wealth, or dominance to validate their existence. This redefinition of power is threatening to traditional structures because it reveals that control over others is not true strength, it is dependency disguised as authority. A ruler without followers is powerless, but a self-mastered individual remains complete even in isolation. This silent reality unsettles those who base their identity on hierarchy and dominance. True power, as embodied by the independent person, lies in the ability to live freely without fear of loss. And when others witness this, it forces them to question the very foundation of their ambitions, creating discomfort that is difficult to ignore. Every society builds its stability on shared identities, national, cultural, professional, or ideological. These collective labels give people a sense of belonging and security. But when someone refuses to define themselves by these identities, they become an outlier, a reminder that individuality can exist beyond group labels. Their refusal to conform makes others feel exposed, as if their carefully constructed sense of self is fragile without group validation. This challenge is not loud or aggressive, it is subtle but powerful. The independent person shows that it is possible to belong to humanity itself without being bound by narrow categories. Such freedom is unsettling for those who cling tightly to collective identities for meaning and protection. Instead of inspiring curiosity, it often provokes defensiveness, because the very existence of such individuals questions the depth of people's loyalty to groups they never truly chose. In a world dominated by constant noise, opinions, debates, and self-promotion, the one who remains silent gains unexpected power. Silence is often mistaken for weakness, but in reality, it creates space for reflection. When an independent person chooses not to argue, not to defend, and not to seek validation, their silence unsettles others more than words ever could. It forces people to confront their own noise, insecurity, and restless dependence on acknowledgement. Their calm presence speaks louder than arguments, showing that true strength does not need to prove itself. Over time, such silence turns into influence, because people notice that in moments of chaos, the quiet individual remains centered. That unshakable stillness becomes a model of resilience, and even those who resist it cannot ignore the hidden authority it carries. The independent individual does not seek to inspire, yet their way of living often awakens unspoken desires in others. Deep inside, many people long for freedom, from constant validation, endless striving, and the pressure to conform. But they suppress these desires out of fear. When they encounter someone who lives fully independent of such pressures, it stirs something within them. Instead of admiration, this often creates discomfort, because it reminds them of what they secretly want but are too afraid to pursue. The uneasiness comes not from the independent person's actions, but from the mirror they hold up to others' unfulfilled lives. This awakening is powerful, because once the possibility of freedom has been seen, it cannot be unseen. And that realization, more than anything else, explains why society struggles to accept such individuals with ease. The presence of independent individuals unsettles society not because they are destructive, but because they reveal possibilities that most people are afraid to face. They cannot be controlled, they break illusions, they challenge identities, and they embody a form of power that requires no recognition. Their silence, their detachment, and their refusal to conform become a mirror in which others see their own dependence, fears, and compromises. And that reflection is often too uncomfortable to bear. Yet, this discomfort is also a hidden invitation. It is an invitation to step beyond the limits of approval, to question the structures we accept without thought, and to reclaim the freedom that lies within self-mastery. In the end, society may resist such individuals, but it cannot erase the truth they represent, that the deepest strength is found not in control over others, but in sovereignty over oneself.